In 2017, I applied to Y Combinator, and we got accepted. Me and my team had gotten accepted into Y Combinator. That was after trying 6 times. So on the sixth try, we got in, but we didn't do it. We dropped out on the first day.
What?
Yeah, dropped out on the first day. And I remember it was a very, very difficult decision. But the reason why we dropped out was because the whole point of going into Y Combinator at that time, and obviously it's changed, is that at the end of the day, as an entrepreneur, you get a lot of exposure very quickly to a bunch of investors, right? So we were very, very lucky that we ended up building and getting that exposure and building the relationship, and ended up getting a term sheet, multiple term sheets before doing Y Combinator. And so eventually we made the decision not to, but it was a very, very difficult decision. And the reason I say this is because for me emotionally, as I mentioned, like it was always kind of like a personal dream as an entrepreneur to be part of Y Combinator. So I remember getting the call from one of the partners, and I literally started crying, and then going from crying to then 3 months later deciding that, oh, you know what, maybe it's best for the company for us not to do Y Combinator, and dropping out. Literally, I think it was the first official day that they were starting, and they were really asking us like, hey, we need you to make a decision. And so we decided not to.
Ashar, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Feeling pretty energized. It's a beautiful day in San Francisco.
Okay, let's talk about your current company, Bounti.ai. Could you please explain about it?
Yeah, so Bounti.ai has gone through a really interesting journey over the last 4 years, right? So we had initially started as a B2B tech go-to-market AI company. So think about having an AI assistant that helps you with your go-to-market tasks. So if you're a salesperson who needs to create a deck for a customer and needs to do it in a few minutes, that's what Bounti does for you. Now, here's the interesting thing. We've gone through a bunch of different stages. The company has probably pivoted maybe 4 or 5 times. And now what we have sort of pivoted into a space which is really interesting is real estate, property tech. Where we found is that, hey, because this domain of property, the real estate and real estate agents have a really heavy need for content creation. And they're missing an AI assistant like workflow for them. So now Bounti has transformed into an AI assistant for real estate agents. Specifically, we help them with a lot of video-based content creation, which is something that's really important to real estate agents. And we do that in minutes versus days, weeks, or hours. Is what hours, days, or weeks is what it typically takes. The one thing I will say is that we have another product as part of this journey we launched called Narrative. So we took our B2B go-to-market assistant, we rebranded it as Narrative.io, and Bounti has become a realist. So now we have actually 2 companies, 2 products, which is cool.
Different company.
Same company, different product, different brands, right? So it's almost like Facebook and Instagram, and so it's a very similar model, but at a very seed stage, versus this is typically what companies do at later stages.
I see. Thank you so much. So, as a Bounti.ai, how did you discover the end user's pain point in real estate industry?
So this is really interesting. Actually, a lot of credit for this goes to my co-founder and partner, Matt Cooley. He's an amazing partner for me. I've been very, very lucky and fortunate to be working with them. But when we first started building Bounti, this is the typical wisdom or guidance that a lot of early stage founders get, especially in the Bay Area, which I think is not that relevant anymore, which is, hey, go sell to other tech companies because they're really, forward thinking and further ahead. And so it's a double-edged sword. I would say it's now becoming more of it doesn't help you that much anymore. That's how we started. We're like, hey, let's build a product for a company that's 5 stages ahead of us, that's figured this problem out. Let's solve it for them, and then we can kind of sell it to more and more of those types of tech. That's how Bounti initially started. And as we started sort of going through that journey, we learned a lot. We learned a lot about the user pain. And so I'd say back in May of this year, we rebuilt our product in like a week. which was amazing. Relaunched it as a completely different thing, which was, hey, go-to-market assistant for anybody, an AI assistant. And we just put it out there. And we started seeing a lot of real estate agents and folks from the real estate industry start coming into and signing up for the product. So we're like really curious, like, hey, what's going on? Why are all these folks signing up? And then my co-founder, Matt, was like, hey, I think there's a real problem here because I just went through the exercise of selling my home and it was pretty painful, right? So let's go and explore this space more. So we started talking to several dozen, if not, more real estate agents and folks that own real estate agencies, and just started asking them about their pain. And lo and behold, what we found was a couple of really interesting things. One is, the real estate agent, the industry doesn't change as fast as some of the other ones that are more tech forward. So we were really excited about that. We're like, wow, these people have a real pain, but also more importantly, they appreciate if you solve the pain for them. Whereas when you're selling to other tech companies, they're like, oh yeah, cool, it's nice that you're doing that for us, but I can do that. That's the mindset. But we're coming into an audience that's not very as tech aware as some of the other industries. So that was one big learning. The second thing was, the idea was, do we have to rebuild everything from scratch, or can we take our existing product? What are pieces of that we can stitch together quickly and go into the space? And so that was the other opportunity, is to say, hey, the time and cost of doing something like that is very minimal. So let's go. And then the third learning was, do we have an unfair advantage through some relationships, through some partnerships, which again, my co-founder, Matt, he has the relationships in some of the premier highest performing teams in the industry. So that's who we learn from. So we partner with them, partner with them, learn very quickly where the pain was, and then launch that product very, very quickly. Because in today's day and age, speed is everything. I see. Yeah. Right. So again, we took the learnings from that space of very generic sort of content creation for everybody to say, okay, let's go very narrow, very niche into real estate. Right. But that doesn't mean we didn't have to get rid of our old product, because in today's world, just given how cheap and fast it's become to build multiple products, you can run multiple companies, multiple compounding startups together. Yeah. Essentially is what it is. I see. So that's why we went in. There's a real pain there.
Okay, let's go back to the topic about Bounti.ai. So do you remember, how did you get your first paid client? Of course, it's B2B, so some real estate company.
Yeah, so let's see. Maybe I'll go back to, just generally getting your first paid, because things have changed. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about my last company, Blameless, because I went through the same exercise. And I do think that there are some good things that an accelerator like Y Combinator does really enforce. What they really push you for is understand the customer pain and stay focused on the customer pain. Everything else is a distraction. Because once you do that and you solve that problem, then everything kind of follows from there, including revenue, including paid customer. So it's not even about, the focus should not be how do I get a paid customer. It's how am I solving a real pain, and how big is that pain? So if there's a big enough pain, then it is. So let's just take the example of, let's just go back to Bounty for a second. So I've done this at Blameless, then at Bounty, again, we were hopping around in different, kind of spaces and go to market, and finally landed on real estate, property tech. But the way that this happened is when we were talking to a bunch of real estate agents and interviewing them, they said, oh, we have a lot of pain around filling out forms. Because part of our job, and when we have to put up a listing for sale, a real estate listing online, let's say on Zillow or Redfin, it has to go into what's called the MLS, the multiple listing system, right? And then it gets picked up by Zillow and Redfin, and then you can market it. But that process is very painful. It takes me 3 hours to type up these notes and all this kind of stuff. And sometimes I have an operations person who does it. Sometimes it's the real estate agent who does it. And a lot of times they're like, this is too much work. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to have somebody else do it. So I remember we were sitting in this group and asking them the question, and we didn't have to even build the product. This is the signal you need. If we reduce the amount of time it takes somebody on your team to fill out the form from 3 hours to 10 minutes. Yeah, 3 hours to 10 minutes. Is that worth $49 per month to you? Would you pay? And I'd say 9 out of 10 people in the room said yes. So we're like, okay, great. That's the signal. Let's go build that. Okay, how fast can we go build that? Now that eventually evolved into, doing video recordings and being able to automatically transcribe or capture notes from the video itself, right? But it evolved. But my point is, we didn't have to build anything to get the signal of like, hey, somebody's willing to pay. Then you can basically start making incremental progress to say, and stay really, really close to the user. A lot of times it's become harder now because everything happens remote. But in my blameless days, I would go and sit physically next to the user and I would say, okay, show me what you're doing right now. And they would do their job. And I'd be like, okay, now use my app to do the same job. And you don't influence them. You just watch. And then you can interview them and ask them, hey, how painful was that? How good was that? Would you pay? Oh, will you pay? Here's a credit card machine. So you're saying so this is the other thing that I think a lot of founders struggle with. I did myself, which is, especially technical founders, is that they don't feel comfortable asking for money.
I agree.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not easy because again, this is your baby. You see both the good and the bad. Yeah. So a lot of times you amplify the bad in your mind. You're like, oh, it's not as good. It's not as, and so why should I even ask to pay for it? It's not that good. I need to make it perfect and stuff like that. You don't do that. So I think literally being ready with a Stripe link or a physical credit card machine and saying, okay, you think that this is worth this much for you. Are you willing to sign a contract with me today?
Right now.
Right now. Are you willing to, if you have a physical, are you willing to put your credit card on this right now? Can you, if I give you a Stripe link, can you go and fill it out right now? Right now. I won't let you leave this room, Kauri, unless you give me your credit card information. So that's literally what you have to do. Be ready. Yeah.
Genius.
Yeah.
How did you find this? How did you make wonderful process?
I was very obviously through my own failures, like a lot of mistakes that I made, but this is not new to me. This is, again, a lot of accelerator programs teach you this. I was very lucky that I had some amazing friends that had gone through Y Combinator before, that had started companies before, and they gave me the same advice, right? Good friend of mine, his name is Ben Mappin. This is the advice he gave me, which is like, don't leave the room until you get a credit card, or you get them to sign the contract, right? So I really take that to heart because I realized that was my biggest weakness. I was like, yes, great, you have these great ideas, you can build a great product, so can anybody else, but can I push myself out of the comfort zone and really, because here's the thing, a lot of times what people don't realize is, when you are solving a problem for someone, especially if you're selling B2B, right? There's actually real a sense of ROI. When you're selling to a consumer, it's hard. It's much harder, depending on the price point. But for enterprises, it's very clear. Like there's a lot of clear metrics, which is, hey, if I solve this problem for you, you're gonna make this much more money. And is that worth 10% of that? Yeah. Yes. Oh, if I solve this problem for you, I've saved you 3 hours. You're getting paid $300 an hour. That's whatever, $900. I've just saved you $900. Are you willing to give me $100 today for that? So there's a lot of these things that are available to people. I think it's not as accessible and people aren't necessarily aware of it, but it just takes that step. And what's the worst that's going to happen? People are going to say no. But what I think folks need to realize is that no is a gift. It's a gift because you're learning something. Right? It's not an attack on you. If you say no to me, Kauri, and I'm asking you to buy something, I shouldn't take it personally because, hopefully you like me as a person and you're like, hey, no, but that's a signal that says, hey, this is not solving my problem for me. And if you don't have that signal early on, you're going to waste a lot of time and cycles. And for early stage companies, a lot of times that means death of the startup. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful wisdom. Have you ever joined any accelerators?
In 2017, I applied to Y Combinator and we got accepted. Me and my team had gotten accepted into Y Combinator. That was after trying 6 times. So on the 6th try, we got in. But we didn't do it. We dropped out on the first day.
What?
Yeah, dropped out on the first day. And I remember it was a very, very difficult decision. But the reason why we dropped out was because the whole point of going into Y Combinator at that time, and obviously it's changed, is that at the end of the day, as an entrepreneur, you get a lot of exposure very quickly to a bunch of investors, right? So we were very, very lucky that we ended up building and getting that exposure and building the relationship, and ended up getting a term sheet, multiple term sheets before doing Y Combinator. And so eventually we made the decision not to, but it was a very, very difficult decision. And the reason I say this is because for me emotionally, as I mentioned, like it was always kind of like a personal dream as an entrepreneur to be part of Y Combinator. So I remember getting the call from one of the partners and I literally started crying, and then going from crying to then, 3 months later deciding that, oh, you know what, maybe it's best for the company for us not to do Y Combinator, and dropping out. Literally, I think it was the first official day that they were starting, and they were really asking us like, hey, we need you to make a decision. And so we decided not to. So yes, part of that accelerator program. Yeah, space. But it really came down to, at the time, us deciding that, hey, we're giving up a lot of equity in the company for, some level of cash that Y Combinator gave you at the time. I don't know what it looks like right now, because again, this is a long time ago. This is 8 years ago. So giving that up, and then at the end of the day you get more exposure to maybe more investors. So it's not like the outcome would have changed for us that dramatically. Again, very lucky, very fortunate to be in that kind of position, because not everybody gets that kind of position, but that was the main reason why. The economics and the math didn't add up for us, right? Right. But so it was a tough decision.
The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Ashar, part 1. 1. Hard choices at Y Combinator. Ashar shared how he applied to Y Combinator 6 times before finally being accepted, only to drop out on the very first day. It was an emotional decision, but he realized the economics didn't make sense for his company since they had already secured multiple term sheets. That lesson: sometimes founders must let go of personal dream to do what's best for the business. 2. Pivoting until the pain point is clear. Bounti.ai pivoted 4 to 5 times before landing the real estate space. By watching who was naturally signing up, talking to dozens of agents, and listening to their struggles, the team discovered a clear pain point. Real estate agents desperately needed a faster way to create video and listening content. This showed how narrowing to a specific industry can unlock real traction. 3. Validate with real payments, not just interest. Ashar emphasized the importance of asking customers to pay even before building the product. By testing willingness to pay $49 per month for reducing a 3-hour tasks to 10 minutes, they confirmed demand quickly. He advised founders to be bold, ask for credit card in the room, and treat every no as a gift that gives valuable insight. Okay, thank you so much for listening to our podcast today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. And the next episode is the conversation with Ashar Part 2. Please stay tuned. Okay? Thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。